The desert, they say, keeps its secrets, burying them beneath shifting sands and the bleaching sun. But some secrets, like the bones of forgotten men, refuse to stay buried. They rise with the dust devils whispered on the wind that scrapes across sun-baked rock and cling to the souls of those who dare to listen. Elias Thorne, a man whose hands had known the weight of both law and sorrow, had listened for too long. His secret wasn't a hidden grave or a lost fortune. It was a ghost, with living eyes, a spectre named Josiah Vance, who had walked away from the gallows Elias had prepared for him a decade past. 10 years had eroded the sharpness of Elias's badge, but not the gnawing ache in his conscience. He was no longer the swift-draw lawman of the territories, but a solitary figure, a shadow amongst the living drifting from one forgotten town to another, each dust-choked street a mirror reflecting his failure. He carried the weight of Josiah's unpunished crimes, a burden heavier than any bounty, a stain on the ledger of justice he had once sworn to uphold. The desert, in its vast, indifferent silence, offered no absolution, only the endless, mocking horizon. It was a landscape that swallowed men whole, leaving behind only echoes and the bleached white of their ambitions. Elias remembered the day Vance had slipped through his grasp with the clarity of a fresh wound. The small, forgotten settlement of Oakhaven, now little more than a ghost town, had been the stage for Vance's brutality. A family of homesteaders, their dreams as fragile as spun glass, shattered by a greed as old as the mountains themselves. Elias had tracked Vance for weeks through canyons that seemed to swallow light, across plains where the sun beat down like a hammer. He had finally cornered him, disarmed him, felt the rough hemp of the noose in his hands. But fate, or perhaps something more malevolent, had intervened. A sudden violent sandstorm, a maelstrom of red dust and roaring wind had descended, blinding, disorienting. When the storm lifted, Vance was gone, swallowed by the fury of the desert, leaving Elias standing alone amidst the devastation, the rope still clutched in his shaking hand, a symbol of his abject failure. The memory had festered, a constant irritant in the quiet corners of his mind, a silent judge of his every waking moment. It was in the desolate whisper of Redemption Gulch, a town aptly misnamed, that the whispers grew louder. Redemption Gulch was less a town and more a wound in the earth, a collection of sun-baked shacks clinging precariously to the lip of a forgotten silver vein that had long since run dry. Its single street was a river of dust, its inhabitants a skeletal crew of the defeated and the forgotten. A faded daguerreotype found clutched in the skeletal hand of a prospector consumed by the desert's thirst bore the unmistakable defiant gaze of Josiah Vance. The face was older, etched with the same lines of ruthlessness Elias remembered, but it was him. A cold certainty settled in Elias's gut, the kind that precedes a storm, silent but inevitable. The ghost had returned, and with it, the chance for Elias to finally bury his own. Redemption Gulch was a graveyard of ambition, a place where dreams had turned to dust and hopes to bitter ash. Its clapboard buildings sagged under the relentless sun, their paint peeled and cracked like ancient skin. Its single saloon, The Last Chance, offered little more than watered-down whiskey and a mournful silence, its patrons few and far between, lost in their own private miseries. Elias found a room at the boarding house, its air thick with the scent of dust and fading memories, a thin curtain of despair hanging over every worn piece of furniture. He moved through the town like a wraith, his eyes scanning every shadow, every face for the phantom of Josiah Vance. He asked no questions, for the desert had taught him that answers often found their way to those who waited, and that impatience was a vice that the land would punish with cruel efficiency. He learned to read the subtle shifts in the wind, the uneasy glances of the locals, the way the dogs slunk away from certain doorways. Days bled into weeks. The sun rose and set, painting the sky in violent hues of orange and purple, mirroring the turmoil within Elias. He ate little, slept less, his senses sharpened by an obsession that had become the very air he breathed, thin and burning. He would sit for hours outside the saloon, observing a silent sentinel against the backdrop of the desolate town. The town's inhabitants, a motley collection of drifters, failed miners, and silent women barely registered his presence. They were too busy fighting their own silent battles against the desolation that surrounded them, the slow grinding erosion of hope that was Redemption Gulch's true currency. They were oblivious to the deeper, more ancient conflict Elias carried within his bones, a personal reckoning that had been a decade in the making. One evening, as the last sliver of sun bled away behind the jagged peaks painting the sky in a bruised violet, Elias saw him. Not in the saloon where the dim light and the clinking of glasses might offer a full sense of anonymity, nor on the main street where passing eyes might catch a glimpse. But perched on the edge of the town's highest bluff, a solitary figure silhouetted against the dying light. Josiah Vance. He was older, greyer his frame, thinner. His movements perhaps a touch slower, but the posture, the way he held himself, was still that of a predator. There was no recognition in Vance's gaze as he surveyed the valley below, only a cold, detached assessment, as if the world itself were merely prey, or perhaps a map of forgotten opportunities. Elias watched from the shadows of a crumbling adobe wall, a silent hunter stalking a ghost. He felt no surge of vengeance, no triumphant satisfaction. Only a profound weariness, the weight of a decade pressing down on his shoulders, the cumulative burden of unfulfilled justice. The air grew still, the only sound, the distant mournful howl of a coyote, a lament for something lost, something broken, something that could never be reclaimed. This wasn't about justice anymore. It was about an end. An end to the haunting, an end to the phantom Josiah Vance had become in Elias's mind, an end to the promise unkept, the oath broken. It was about severing the last thread that bound him to a past that gnawed at his very soul. He followed Vance in the following days, a shadow amongst shadows. Vance seemed to be waiting too, though for what Elias could not discern. He spent his days at the edge of town, observing the comings and goings, his eyes as sharp as a hawk's missing nothing. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were clipped devoid of warmth like stones scraped across a dry creek bed. He was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape as Redemption Gulch itself, a figure of stone and silence, a walking monument to a past that refused to lie down. The few times he ventured into the saloon, a palpable silence would descend, a testament to the fear he inspired, without uttering a single threat. He drank his whiskey slowly, his gaze sweeping the room, calculating, assessing. Elias learned that Vance was prospecting not for gold but for something else. Something hidden beneath the earth that held a deeper, more personal value to him. He would disappear for hours into the surrounding hills, returning each evening with dirt on his hands and a grim set to his jaw, never speaking of his finds. The townspeople steered clear of him, sensing the unspoken threat that radiated from his silent form, the coiled danger that lay just beneath the surface of his stillness. He was a wound that refused to heal, a shadow that clung to the edges of their meager lives, a living testament to the harsh, unforgiving nature of the West. The days of silent vigil culminated on a sun-drenched afternoon. The air shimmered with heat, the distant mountains wavered like mirages. Elias watched Vance descend into a narrow canyon, a place known locally as the Serpent's Coil, due to its treacherous winding path and the unsettling stillness that often settled within its depths. It was a place of isolation, of secrets, a perfect stage for a final reckoning, a place where the world narrowed to a single inevitable point. Elias hesitated, only for a moment, the weight of his unfulfilled duty pulling him forward, the memory of those Vance had wronged, whispering in the wind, a ghostly chorus urging him on. He followed his boots, kicking up dust each step, a step deeper into the past, deeper into the heart of his own torment. The canyon walls rose steeply on either side, sheer faces of ancient rock scarred by millennia of wind and water, casting long, cool shadows that offered a momentary reprieve from the relentless sun. The air grew still heavy with the scent of sun-baked earth and dry brush, the only sound the crunch of Elias's boots on the loose scree, and the distant, almost imperceptible ringing of a pickaxe, a metallic echo that seemed to vibrate in the very air. The silence was not empty, but pregnant with anticipation. He found Vance at the mouth of a dark, narrow cave, its entrance like a gaping maw in the canyon wall. Vance's back was to Elias, his form silhouetted by the faint light that penetrated the cave's depths. A pickaxe glinting in his hand, he was chipping away at a seam of rock, his movements deliberate, methodical, almost ritualistic. The sound of the pickaxe echoed eerily in the confined space, a metallic clang that seemed to vibrate in Elias's very bones, a relentless rhythm of time passing, of a destiny approaching. This was it. The moment had arrived unannounced, unadorned, as sudden and inevitable as a viper's strike in the stillness of the desert. Elias drew his old peacemaker, its weight, familiar in his hand, a ghost of comfort, a forgotten extension of his will. The years had worn the bluing from its barrel, leaving it a dull, pitted grey, but its purpose remained unchanged. He raised it, his aim steady. His breath held every nerve taut, every sense sharpened. Vance paused, his back still to Elias, as if sensing the presence, the cold breath of retribution that had finally caught up to him. He turned slowly, the pickaxe still in his hand, his eyes dark and fathomless like twin wells of ancient knowledge locking with Elias's. There was no surprise in Vance's gaze, no fear, no pleading. Only a weary recognition, as if he had been expecting this confrontation for a decade, had carried it like a stone in his own gut. The lines on his face deepened, not with age, but with the grim acceptance of a long-delayed fate. He did not speak, did not move, simply stood there, a man awaiting his judgment, a figure carved from the very silence that surrounded them. The silence stretched thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant, mournful cry of a hawk circling high above a lonely lament in the vast, indifferent sky. Elias's finger tightened on the trigger. The faces of the dead, the wronged, flickered in his mind's eye, a silent chorus demanding recompense, a legion of whispers urging him to finish what he started. But then something shifted within him, a subtle tremor that rippled through the decades of his pursuit. The years of carrying this burden had not hardened him, but softened him, worn away the sharp edges of vengeance, leaving only the dull ache of regret, a profound and hollow empathy. Was this truly justice, he wondered, or just the weary closing of a chapter he should have finished long ago, a desperate attempt to quiet the demons that had ridden him for too long? The bullet would be a finality, yes, but would it truly bring peace or merely another kind of emptiness? Vance, still silent, slowly lowered the pickaxe, letting it rest against the cave wall with a soft clatter, a sound that seemed to echo with the weight of unspoken history. His gaze remained fixed on Elias, a silent question. In its depths, a mirror reflecting Elias's own internal struggle. It was not an act of surrender, but of acceptance, a grim acknowledgement of the debt owed, a silent understanding passing between two men who had been bound by an invisible thread for a decade. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the echoes of a past that refused to die, but now finally seemed ready to be laid to rest. Elias lowered his own gun slowly, deliberately. The metallic click of the hammer as he reholstered it resonated in the stillness, a sound of choice of a path not taken. He looked at Vance, truly, looked at him, not as a phantom, not as the embodiment of his failure, but as a man broken by time and consequence, just as Elias himself was, albeit in different ways. The fire of vengeance had flickered and died, replaced by a profound, desolate understanding, a shared exhaustion. The justice he sought was not in a bullet, but in the quiet, agonizing burden they both carried, a penance that transcended the simple scales of law. Vance nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, his eyes still holding Elias's, acknowledging the unspoken truce, the shared weight of their existences. He turned back to the cave wall, picking up his axe once more. The rhythmic clang of the pickaxe resumed, echoing in the confined space, a testament to continued effort, to a different kind of burden. Elias stood there for a long moment, the dust motes dancing in the slivers of light that penetrated the cave's mouth, the weight of the desert pressing in on him, ancient and unyielding. He turned and walked away, leaving Vance to his solitary work, to his own desolate search for whatever he sought within the earth, be it silver or solace, or simply a place to finally lay his own demons to rest. The sun was dipping below the horizon as Elias emerged from the canyon, casting long purple shadows across the landscape, painting the world in hues of twilight and transition. The air was cool now, carrying the faint, clean scent of sage and damp earth, a reprieve from the day's oppressive heat. He did not look back, did not break the quiet understanding that had passed between them. Redemption. Gulch appeared in the distance, its few lights beginning to twinkle like fallen stars, small beacons in the encroaching darkness. The ghost of Josiah Vance no longer haunted him. The secret finally was buried, not beneath the sand, but within the silent understanding of two men linked by a shared past, and the unforgiving judgment of the land, a judgment that was often more subtle and far more profound than any human law. He rode out of Redemption Gulch before dawn, leaving no trace, no farewells, just another silhouette swallowed by the vastness. The desert stretched before him, vast and indifferent, a canvas for new stories, new shadows, but perhaps now with a faint glimmer of hope in its endless expanse. He was still a solitary figure, but the weight on his soul felt lighter. The horizon less mocking the air, easier to breathe. The journey was not over for a man like Elias Thorne. The road stretched on, but the haunting had ceased. And in the desolate beauty of the West that was as close to redemption as a man could ever hope to find a quiet internal peace forged in the crucible of his own past. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying no names, no promises, only the eternal, untamed song of the land, a song of endurance and perhaps of quiet forgiveness.